I want to talk a little bit about my friend and colleague here, Darrell Brazell, because Darrell is a pastor, he's a teacher, he's an author, and you know, as I was thinking about Darrell's ministry, I see it as one of God's lifeguards here for those of us in leadership and our families, because what Darrell's doing is really on the front lines of a ministry that's much needed for a problem that really is prevalent in our families, our communities, our churches. There's just so much. There's so much here. And Darrell, I just want to welcome you. I'm gonna ask you, Darrell, to talk a little bit about New Hope Recovery Ministries. Tell us what you do, who you are, what floats your boat here, and why you do this breakthrough ministry. So, Darrell, welcome. Thanks for being here.
All right. Good to have you. In fact, I probably just button came up, show my screen, so now my computer's going through other stuff. Let me get every time it comes back on, I have to redo it. So anyway, so hopefully my screen's back up, correct?
Well, not yet, but
okay. Anyway, sorry for the distraction. But
not a problem.
New Hope Fellowship and our recovery ministry is really the outgrowth of my own personal journey. February 2000, I'll try to do the very short version of it. I came out of my own lifelong struggle with pornography and masturbation. And in 2001, I started my first group for men wrestling with sexually addictive issues. And then through some crazy set of events, in 2004, we started New Hope Fellowship as a church based on brokenness and recovery. And so today, it's pretty fuzzy what's New Hope Fellowship Church and what's New Hope Recovery Ministries, but there's a lot of overlap. Also in 2004, my wife Debbie started a group for the wives of the men in my group, and as a result of that, I started doing a lot more couples work and a lot of work with individual wives as they process through the pain of learning of their husband's struggle and then dealing with their own traumas that played into it as well. And so over the past 12 years, I've worked with hundreds of couples in the painful process of facing and dealing with sexual addiction. And this is especially impactful in the early stages of dealing with it. And one of the things that the Father has really placed on my heart is the desperate need for men and leaders and pastors, especially, to become protectors of Eve instead of consumers of Eve. And I just got the new Joy Starts Here book in the mail yesterday, and I was real excited to start digging into it and see that Jim and Ed and the crew have taken this term protector and made it an important part of the Joy Starts Here model. And it's interesting how sometimes when you see something come from a different place where you know the people and you know where they're coming from, and you know they didn't get it from you, but you both ended up with real emphasis on the same term, you just kind of like, that might be something God's doing. So I think this is an important thing. The other reason that
I want to jump in real quick, Darrell, if I could. We still can't see your slides. I don't know if your computer's on a coffee break, giving you some problems there, but
you might need to click on Show My Screen again.
It says Show Screen.
You have to click Show My Screen.
I did. It's now saying pause. It says on air showing screen. And I can click stop showing screen.
Might want to do that and start over.
Screen. Did it show now?
Not over here.
I don't see anything.
It was working fine when we were trying to record.
I know.
Chris, I am going to email you my file real quick.
Okay.
And then I will just talk.
You'll talk, and then when I get your files, I'll let Denny know, and we can put them up there.
Or would it be better to send it to Denny?
Either way.
Either way, yeah. It's nice what we can do here with technology, even when technology throws some curveballs.
course, now I'm realizing that I haven't even saved this file yet. So
while you do that, Darrell, I just want to let our friends know that I remember meeting Darrell, boy, I don't know how many years ago it was, but I know that we've had Darrell speak at some of our Thrive Applications events. And when I say that Darrell is on the front lines of this ministry, as you're going to hear from him, and as you're already hearing from him, he's not only has the experience, but this is something that keeps, there's no shortage of opportunities for help from other leaders who are wrestling and struggling with these issues. And so last time we had Darrell on, Darrell focused really on some of the issues with addictions and how addictions happen and how our brain really develops these patterns. And what Darrell's going to unpack for us today is what he's called protecting Eve. How overwhelm, trauma, and dishonesty hinder marriage joy. And so I think a lot of our friends today are going to be really excited to hear more as soon as we can get our slides up and running.
I've emailed them, so I think I can just go ahead and jump in. My slides really aren't that critical. There's some stuff later on that'd be great to have up there, but it's not critical. So,
all right.
Anyway, this idea of protecting Eve has really been a key point that's come out of primarily me seeing the pain in my own wife's journey and also the deep pain of the hundreds of wives and couples who've been in my office. And part of this place also comes from the countless ways I've seen the church fail miserably in addressing both the needs of a husband to deal honestly and completely with his sin, and even fail worse in the area of coming alongside the wife who is inevitably deeply hurt and often in a place of great trauma. And that's where the title of the seminar I did last year comes from, as well as a whole new branch of our ministry that we're developing called Protecting Eve. And in the book of James, James says that religion that our God the Father accepts as pure and faultless is this: to look after orphans and widows in their distress and to keep oneself from being polluted by the world. I personally believe that we have an epidemic of what I call pornography widows. Women who have lost their husbands to the seductive dragon of pornography and sexual sin, and yet, unfortunately, for the most part, the church remains mostly silent on this devastating issue. And it's devastating in part because Genesis 3:16 says, God tells Eve that, quote, your desire will be for your husband, and he will rule over you. Now, unfortunately, we don't have time to really dive fully into this verse. However, what I want us to see is just how important it is to a woman to be loved, honored, and cherished by the man in her life. And yet, when a man chooses to spend his emotional and sexual energy on a fantasy woman instead of his wife becomes a desolate woman, whether or not she knows what he is doing. For example, if he successfully hides his sin from her, then she invariably believes, well, there must be something wrong with me. There must be something wrong with me that prevents my husband from emotionally connecting. And then in the bedroom, she either faces his lack of attention because he's taking care of his own sexual needs through fantasy, or else she must endure his disconnected, joyless, and often abusive paradigm of sex that he has learned through pornography. And this does incredible harm. And one of the most destructive aspects of pornography is that it presents a distorted perspective of sexual acts, behaviors, and attitudes that is solely focused on selfish pleasure rather than relational joy. There's a website out there by Shelley Lubin, and I mention it somewhat reluctantly because some of the stories on there are a little too graphic. It can be very triggering, especially for men who have weakness or tendencies to struggle in this area. And yet it's also very powerful, because on her site she has the tragic and yet amazing stories, because of God's rescue in their lives, of women who were lured into and often tricked and even enslaved into the pornography industry. They describe what they had to do to themselves in order to do the films. They speak of being drugged, sometimes by themselves, to numb the pain, and sometimes by others without even their knowledge. They speak of vomiting on the set or immediately upon leaving because of the defilement they felt. And of course, those aspects never appear on the final product. The final product shows her smiling and making it look as if she's living the dream, when her reality is much more of what Fantine sings so powerfully in Les Mis. I had a dream my life would be so different from this hell that I'm now living. And I know that's some rough material to begin with, but the reason I bring it up is because pornography creates an incredibly distorted view of God's beautiful gift of sexuality that too often men, and unfortunately now due to the tsunami of pornography in our culture, even more and more women are bringing into the bedroom. And this distorted view of sexuality brings an incredible amount of trauma into the lives of women. And unfortunately, too often they are told by counselors, pastors, and friends, don't worry about it, it's just fantasy, all men do it, and a whole myriad of other really harmful things. And the end result is trauma. Trauma for many, many wives, and a continued low joy existence for both husband and wife. For many wives, the low joy they experience also then becomes a contributing factor that depletes their joy capacity, so that when their husband's sexual acting out behaviors come to light, they experience great trauma. And the point I want you to see in that is that the discovery of sexual sin often creates trauma that overwhelms. Some wives have little to no knowledge of their husband's betrayals until they accidentally discover something on the computer, or he comes home telling her he's been fired at work for looking at pornography, or, as I've had more than one wife find out, he comes home to tell her that she needs to get tested because he has an STD. And when this happens, the wife is almost always devastated. Remember, he promised her on their wedding day that he would love, honor, and cherish her, and that he would, quote, forsake all others. And in her mind, all others includes the fantasy women. In his mind, it's often no big deal. After all, he didn't actually cheat on her, and it's not real. And yet I've seen firsthand from my own wife and from hundreds of wives in my office, the pain is incredibly real. And kind of one of the best examples of that is years ago I was working with a couple that had just joined our ministry, and I asked the wife to tell me her story with her husband in the room with us. And she told of a painful childhood with considerable amount of trauma, an alcoholic father, and she told of a teenage experience when she was raped in her own home by a friend. And she went on and she talked about marrying her husband, and then she described the day that she walked into their office and saw him on the computer looking at pornography and making arrangements to meet up with a woman he'd met online. And at this point, she started sobbing, and she made a statement I'll never forget. She said, "This hurts so much more than being raped." And my heart broke for her, and thankfully so did her husband's. But I think it causes us to ask an important question. Why? Why is the pain so bad? Why is it trauma? And I think the first answer to that is because it is a severing of a wife's primary attachment. Remember, Genesis 3:16 says, her desire will be for her husband. Her desire is to be loved, to be cherished, to be delighted in. Well, guess what? When a husband devours pornography, when he is finding sexual gratification from looking at airbrushed images of 18-year-old models or watching women pretend to enjoy sexual acts that degrade and often harm them, guess how much delight he has in his 40-year-old wife who has had 3 kids and who is rightfully resistant to the things he has watched in the videos. Dennis Rainey had a great line that I heard many years ago in one of his marriage videos when he said something to the effect of, you know, my granddad spent 9 hours a day looking at the southbound end of a northbound mule. So when he walked in the door of the house in the evening, my grandmother truly was the most beautiful woman in the world to him. Now, while I don't believe God intends for all of us to stare at the southbound end of a northbound mule all day, I do believe he wants each one of us to see our wife as the most beautiful woman in the world. And I believe that God's gift of our sexuality is a tool and a gift that he intended to create that reality for each one of us, because that's what happens in the sexual bonding process. Pornography, however, comes in as a pseudo-joy and destroys that reality. And in the midst of that destruction, it leads me to another real significant point I want to make quickly before we open up for some discussion. And that is that John Eldredge, in his book, Waking the Dead, makes a very powerful point. And he spends several pages talking about the reality that Satan enlists others to do to us what he has been doing to us all our lives. And that's real important. And I see this played out in countless ways in our ministry. And it's a really ugly process where trauma becomes painfully obvious. One of the most powerful examples of this is years ago I worked with a couple whose wife had been sexually abused by her father. The husband only knew a tiny bit. He knew his father-in-law had done something inappropriate, but he didn't know any details. As his wife worked through her trauma with my wife and me, she eventually told of the 2 primary ways her father had violated her. The first was that from her earliest memory until sometime in junior high, she would wake up in the middle of the night with her father fondling her genitalia. The second was that one day when she was in high school, she thought she was home alone and went to take a shower, when all of a sudden her naked father jumped into the shower with her. Now, fast forward several years into her marriage. At this point, her husband worked the late shift and would come home late at night to, midnight, 1 o'clock in the morning. And he would come home and wind down a little bit, and then he would crawl in the bed with her and begin fondling her as his way of initiating sexual relationships. His other way that he would the other way that he would initiate sex is in the morning. He would wake up and hear her in the shower, and he would go join her in the shower. Now, I'm sure that you can imagine very quickly what that did to her. It was devastating. And it's also important to note that when her husband finally heard her story, he was devastated because he realized that he was repeating her trauma. However, guess what fed his consumptive behavior and mindset that she was there for his pleasure? Guess what kept him numbed out to the point that he was unable to see her fear and the disassociative place she went to every time he approached her in these ways? It was his habitual use of pornography. And so that's part of why I feel so called, so compelled to be a voice for, quote, protecting Eve. Because I believe the use of pornography, the lies and the deception surrounding it, both within the pornography itself and the lies and deceptions that are so wrapped up in individuals' struggle with it, I believe they are doing damage to more people and greater damage than any of us would like to believe. And I believe that it's long past time that we as pastors, as church leaders, as counselors, as friends, took our heads out of the sand and started dealing with the struggle honestly and directly. And with that said, and I know I've hit some hard stuff already, but where I want to kind of wrap up before we have some time of questions is to let you know that there's good news. There really is hope. There is healing. And I'm Exhibit A of that. My life, I was very wrapped up in my own narcissism, my own self-absorption, and completely disconnected from my wife and my family. And a lot of what kept me in those places was the pseudo-joy that I received from my use of pornography and sexual fantasy. And yet, by the grace of God, He walked me out of my struggle. And so since February of 2000, I have walked in freedom in this arena. And through that freedom, God has been and continues to do a deep work of healing in my life, my wife's life, and in the lives of the individuals and couples that God brings to us. And so I know firsthand that men and women trapped in the bonds of sexual addiction can find healing. I've also learned through the years that God wants to take the very things the enemy intended for our destruction and redeem them and use them for His glory and our blessing. In fact, I believe that Romans 8:28, where He says, in all things, God works together for good for those who love Him, who've been called according to His purposes, applies even in the arena of sexual brokenness. I've experienced that in my own life, and I see it in the people who are willing to go on the incredibly difficult and yet powerful journey of healing in this arena. And so as I kind of wrap up and then hopefully have some dialogue with Chris and hopefully some others, I just want to tell you that there is hope and that there's a number of resources. And I put my resources here because that's what I'm most familiar with, but there's many other resources available as well. But on my website, newhope4si.com, there's several things I want to just draw your attention to. The first is, at the very top of the page is a video called An Apology to Women. And that's something that I filmed at a women's conference in Kansas City a few months ago. And it's just my sincere apology to women for the damage that our consumptive view of sexuality has brought to every woman, even those who are not married. And that'll make more sense if you watch that. Another resource there is my Protecting Eve seminar that we filmed last year. And then there's a teaching called What Every Wife Needs to Know. And that's something that I would love for every woman to listen to so that she would understand more of the struggle that faces her husband, and also so she can recognize the signs when there's things that are wrong and that she's not crazy and it's not her fault. I also have my recovery manual called New Hope for Sexual Integrity, as well as hundreds of free audio teaching files. And for those of you who've been to my website in the past, there's a couple relatively new things for my teaching on the book of Ephesians. One was a series called Grow Up, and that's a series where I took the life model stages of maturity and just stole a lot of good material from Jim Wilder from a number of sources, as well as our own illustrative stuff, and just elaborated what that looks like. And then the other resource that I point on there specifically is a series of sermons I did on the Ephesians passage of husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church. It's called Redeeming Love. And those were some really meaningful messages to me. In fact, they were difficult messages because they challenged me in ways that were incredible to be reminded of. And so I know I've covered a lot of ground quickly, and I can certainly go back and elaborate on any or all of it as you wish, but I thought I'd just kind of throw that out and see where we go from there.
All right. Thank you, Darrell. Yeah, you certainly have given us a lot of important information here. And as we move into a time here, I'm going to activate my webcam. As we move into a time of interacting with people, is it safe to say that whenever we play with this fire of pornography and get ensnared in sexual addiction, basically everybody loses this game, right? Unless we really turn to God for some healing, there's no safe way, is there, to play with this fire?
No, I don't believe there's any safe place. As I've come more and more clear on through the years, it's a distortion, and anytime you play with distortion, crazy things start happening.
Yeah. And is that a lie that you come across with people who start down this road that, well, just a little bit, I'm just going to look? Is that a common deception that you run across, for example, when men first start dabbling in some of this stuff, or?
Well, actually, yes and no.
Okay.
It's not that common because for most men, it began in early childhood.
Mm.
Most men I work with, that it began in their early teens, or even, well, for most men it began 8, 9, 10 years old. And so they were hammered with sexually powerful imagery long before they had the ability to handle or address it or deal with it.
Mm.
And so from that, they never knew a time when they just sort of knew a little bit, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Now, where I say that it does have kind of a beginning state, or that the more common place where it says, okay, well, I'll just take a little look at this, is right now with women and with wives. There's it's becoming more, one of the things we're running into very frequently now is husbands who are, couples where the wife decides, or even is encouraged by the husband, or even sometimes by something she's read in a magazine, or at times even by a marriage counselor, to explore a little pornography as a way of spicing things up, as a way of bringing more excitement to things. And what it does is it just brings in that pseudo-joy. It brings in pleasure, but not joy. And like all counterfeits, it eventually leads to problems.
So for folks who might be new to that term, pseudo-joy, so could you again just highlight what is pseudo-joy? How has this become pseudo-joy for people?
Well, a great illustration of that I actually wrote on for a Life Model blog a couple years ago is they've done an experiment with hummingbirds, where they put out hummingbird feeders with artificial sweetener in it. And so the hummingbirds can't tell the difference between real sugar water and fake sugar water. And the end result is that the hummingbirds keep coming back and keep coming back till they die of malnutrition, because their brain thinks they are drawing in nutrients and sugar, but it's actually a 0-calorie sugar substitute. And the same thing's true in our lives with any beat, but I think especially with sexually addicted beats, is that we come back for these pseudo-joys that give us a feeling that's very close to joy, but without the relational connection. And so what happens is we feel good, we feel excitement, we think we're getting joy, but we're actually getting something with no relational, emotional, nutritional value. And so we end up starving ourselves to death and living from a very low joy place.
And that sounds like a very painful reality right there for families who are working through this. Yeah. All right. I'm willing to guess that our listeners have some questions for you, Darrell. So I want to open up the floor here. If our friends want to ask Darrell a question about some of what he said. This is a kind of topic, Darrell, I think we could sit down all day and just pick your brain on some of this stuff. There's a lot here. So friends, you want to let Denny know you have a question and she can unmute you, or feel free to write in your question or your thought as you're listening to what Darrell has shared with us today.
And we know this is a sensitive topic, so if you want your comment to be read anonymously, just write ANON or something at the beginning, and I'll definitely respect that.
Yes,
But
that's right.
if you're willing to talk, please raise your hand and we'll unmute you.
As these questions come in, Darrell, can I just throw something else out here for you? Is this more prevalent than you think the average person realizes, the average Christian realizes? Is this for those of us in leadership? Are there many of us in leadership that are struggling with this issue and maybe we're afraid to deal with it, or we feel a lot of shame? I mean, is this becoming more and more prevalent in your experience?
I think it's always been prevalent.
Okay.
But I think our sexually saturated culture has certainly amplified how prevalent it is. Mm-hmm. And I think that most church leaders would be absolutely shocked if there was a way to do a real honest, anonymous survey that could find out how many people in their churches, how many of their leaders, how many pastors are caught in the web of pornography and sexual issues on a very regular basis.
Wow, that's really eye-opening, and there's a lot of hurt as a result of that, I would imagine, for those families who are impacted by this.
Yeah, there's rarely a week that goes by that I don't get a call from a pastor from someplace else, or a missionary, or someone in a church leadership position who says, I've been struggling with this all my life, or I've been struggling with this especially bad the last several years, and I'm terrified to talk to anyone about it. I think I'm going to lose my job, I'll lose my family, and yet they're at a place where they can't go on anymore where they're at.
All right, we do have a couple questions now. One person wants to know, have you found this trauma to be the same, whether it is a same-sex addiction or a heterosexual addiction? Meaning the wife discovers that this husband is looking at either same-sex or heterosexual pornography.
Trauma is trauma.
Mm-hmm.
And so any time that there is the new revelation that what I thought I knew I don't know, it's incredibly painful. And we do deal quite often with same-sex attraction issues. Probably maybe a fourth to a fifth of the men who come to us for sexual addiction issues have some aspect of that in their story and in their struggle. And real honestly, where the amount of trauma and pain the wife feels on those things generally has more to do with her overall joy capacity than than the specific nature of her husband's struggle. And I say that with a little qualification. That changes, of course, depending upon the level of acting out. Most the pain is great regardless, but when there's been actual physical contact with others, whether it be heterosexual or homosexual, whenever there's been physical contact with others, there's always an increased level of pain.
All right, another question says, how do you connect the spiritual realm to these things, meaning demonic influence?
Well, let me. That's a complicated question to say the least. But a little of my background: I grew up in a very Bible-believing, mostly rationalistic perspective. And what I mean by that is I grew up hearing the horror stories of what the crazy charismatics are doing. And so I tell you that just from the standpoint of I'm not from that school that sees a demon behind every bush. But what I will tell you is that you can't work with people in this arena very much without having to look honestly at the reality of demonic activity within and around pornography. I could tell you story after story after story of individuals that were at breakthrough moments, and the way the attacks come to them and the opportunities that just literally just drop in their laps is unexplainable outside of there being a very powerful demonic and spiritual battle going on.
Yeah.
The sexual realm is an area where Satan wants to do his, it's his favorite, it's one of, if not his favorite arena to work in, because he knows what God intended for it to be.
Yeah, that's an important point right there, Darrell, that anything that's very important to God obviously will come under a lot of attack.
All right. Okay. I'm going to unmute somebody next. Right. Bob, are you there?
I'm here.
Hi, Bob.
Good morning. Question here, Darrell, and thank you very much for the work you're doing. I really appreciate it. I deal with a number of men coming through where I saw on your list of things about their crock tears versus true repentance. That's one of my biggest struggles, is helping men work through and see that it's not just getting out of trouble. It's got to be a life change. It's got to be, down deep in the heart, dealing with that. And I'm just, in a way, looking for, do you have any tools or things you do to help them face that, instead of minimizing the exposure, to actually dive in and go for it? Because I see that so many women are traumatized over and over again by this kind of stepping into their garbage. Men, instead of just owning the whole thing, they just allow a certain exposure, and then another piece of it comes out, then later another piece, and it just causes hurt upon hurt upon hurt. So
absolutely. And unfortunately, most men begin their journey out of this with, just for lack of better terms, with a mixture of real brokenness and crocodile tears, but not full brokenness. And so one of the things that I really emphasize that helps this process greatly, and it plays into what you're also talking, that process you're talking where a man, confesses X amount of, he confesses maybe 30% of his struggle, and then a month later gets caught again and he confesses 50%, and a couple months later he feels a little more conviction and he confesses another 20%. We call that a death by 1,000 cuts.
Okay.
And it is just a cruel, cruel way, a cruel thing to do to a wife. And so one thing I really emphasize a lot to men is there's no way to come clean in this arena without pain. But there is a way to do it that limits, or at least cuts down the amount of carnage. And it also is very helpful in helping a man come to grips with just how much this struggle has controlled his life. And what that way is I have a very extensive full sexual history inventory in my manual that a man goes through, and it helps him quantify and put on paper every sexual transgression that he's had. And then I have another tool in the manual that is called Telling Your Wife About Your Struggle, where he goes through his inventory and lists all his sexual sins against his wife, so that when he confesses to her again, or some for the first time, he can do it all at once and have a clean slate, both for himself and so that she knows what she's being asked to forgive. And so from that, that allows real healing to begin, because it allows him to move from a place of shame and hiding to a place where someone, and just a side note there, I strongly encourage men to do this with a counselor or with someone who can really help them to begin with, because the wife doesn't need to be the first one to hear it. She needs to hear it after he's gone through it with someone else, for a lot of reasons that we don't have time to get into.
Mm-hmm.
But in that, what that does is that allows the wife to begin from a place that says, okay, I think I have the opportunity to know where truth begins. And that is so much better place. And it also helps the man to recognize that, wow, this problem's bigger than I realized it is, and to recognize that it's a cancer, it's not a cold. Because I think so much of the time that's one of the big problems, is that individuals think they have a cold, and so they want to throw a little cold medicine at it. They're not willing to go through chemotherapy and do whatever it takes to find healing.
Thank you.
Wow.
And that actually kind of leads into a question somebody had. If I could go ahead and read that. I'm going to do it anonymously, even though he didn't say it, because it's just easier. It says, Darrell, though I've dealt with the attraction to pornography, I'm still finding layer after layer of attachment pain, that which likely drove me to hover around the pornography dragon. Is this just an issue of continuing manual experiences and working through those layers?
Yes, and yet, well, I mean, it's certainly, that's a very complicated question. The reality is that pornography and sexual addiction, like any beep, it's the symptom, it's an external symptom of deeper issues. And attachment pain is always a core driving factor in any numbing behavior that we use. And so with, saying, okay, well, I still find areas of attachment pain. Well, the reality is, this side of heaven, we will always be wrestling with certain aspects of attachment pain. I've had the privilege of doing some work with Dr. Carl Lehman in the Emmanuel process, and one of the things I tell my people quite often is that, I could spend every afternoon for months on Dr. Carl's couch, and we could deal with trauma after trauma and attachment pain after attachment pain, and I know I would grow in leaps and bounds. I know that I would experience amazing things, and I know that even when I left, there would still be holes. There would still be wounds. There would still be places that God still continues to want to go after and heal. And so I think a real critical aspect of this is recognizing that, this is a lifelong journey, that none of us get to a place of being healed, but we can experience, I think it was Francis Schaeffer who says that while full healing is not available on this side of heaven, substantial healing is. And I think that there's more healing available to us than most of us realize or ever reach for. And the more that we heal, the better we will be able to deal with our attachment pain, the less we will reach for the temptations of pornography or ice cream or whatever the beat of the moment might be. And yet we also need to recognize that we have an enemy in the world who knows the exact bait to tempt us with. And so many times people wrestle with feeling like they've not made enough progress because they still feel tempted. Well, guess what? That's what the tempter does, is he tempts us. And so the goal is to grow strong enough to grow stronger so that we are more successful and more able to resist those temptations and hence do less damage to ourselves and to others in the process and become more like who he created us to be in the first place.
Yeah, you raised an important point there, Darrell. I just want to highlight for our listeners that the importance of attachment pain, and it sounds like it can be possible that if I just ask God to take away all of my attachment pain forever until I go to heaven, could that become a toxic hope?
Well, if you find the prayer that does that, I'll pay you a lot of money for it.
Yeah. Yeah, that's true. And I really want our people to hear that, and that's one of the things I really appreciate about Dr. Jim Wilder and this concept of suffering well and learning how to be myself and learning how to quiet these big feelings and these big cravings. And yeah, you're just shining the light on so many important solutions here, Darrell.
All right, I've got another quick question. Someone says, what is available for the wives who have discovered that their husbands were involved with pornography and then have left the home already? So what's available for those wives?
Well, I think there's a number of things. I think that, for example, on my website, the apology to women, I think that could speak very clearly to you. I think also many of my teachings, one neat thing about our church's DNA is that because we started as we were a recovery ministry before we were a church, and pretty much everyone in our church has either been in our recovery ministry at one point or they came into the church knowing that that's what, that was a primary focus of the church. So I've had the freedom to speak very directly on subjects that most pastors could not speak on. And on top of that, our kids have always been downstairs. So I've been able to address many things in that arena. And so, for the wife whose husband has chosen dots on a page or pixels on a screen over the reality of her beauty, the first thing, the most important thing I want to say to her is I'm just terribly sorry. I'm sorry that your husband was so foolish that he chose something not real over the real of who you are. And then to encourage you to just experience, to let God meet you in those places, to let God meet you in the middle of your pain and show you that the lies that Satan has planted in you through your husband's rejection. And to recognize that it wasn't a rejection of you, it was a rejection of who God created him to be. And that in that you got caught up in that whirlwind. And I think that you will find many encouraging things in my website, in some of my audio teachings for that. But then also I would just really encourage you to find a community that will grieve with you, that will allow you to wrestle with those hurts and those lies and continually point you back to Emmanuel as the one who is the only one who can truly meet you in those places and be your groom and the one who validates you in ways that no one else can.
Those are powerful words. We've got about 30 seconds left before I need to talk about some resources. And Darrell, I do have the slide up with your websites, with some of your resources, so I'm really hoping that our listeners and viewers will take a look at this work that you're doing because it's so important.
Jerry, I know your hand is up. There's two other questions that are out there, but I think they've already been answered amongst other questions. So I'm going to jump to Jerry and mute you.
Thanks.
Jerry.
Hi, Chris. Hi, Darrell. Just real brief question. Could you talk about some absolutely critical foundation points that a pastor would want to look for in a men's support group in this area?
Good question.
Wow. Well, let me mention two things there. One is on my website, and you might have to look around a little bit for it, there's a teaching called 10 Pastoral Commandments, and it's a teaching specifically for pastors on dealing with sexual addiction issues. And I think that will help with some of that. But then another thing on that is that in looking for groups to point into, I think the most important thing I would look for is a grace-oriented, non-shame-based place for accountability and learning of a new lifestyle. And what I mean by that is that there are some approaches to addiction recovery, and especially sexual addiction recovery, that are still very shame-based. You know, they're telling guys how bad they are, and you got to stop. You know, it's behavior-focused. And there are some people who have found, you know, some freedom from that. However, I personally believe that shame is always a weapon of the enemy. And when I say shame here, I'm talking about, you know, the shame in our identity, not
toxic.
Shame, toxic shame. And so I would steer clear from that. But I would also just look at, you know, the reality is every single church needs a men's integrity group in it. And my manual that I've written was written in a community-based concept that, to be real honest with you, I've had numerous people in places that they've gotten, you know, 2, 3, 4, 5 guys together and just started walking through it together. Wow. And it's created kind of the foundation that they've used. It's got descriptions of what a group meeting looks like and all those things. And so Chris said we have 30 seconds, and I'm sure I've already taken more than that. So.
Yeah, but this is good, and I'm glad that you directed people to more resources, because I have a feeling some of our friends here are going to want to see what you've authored, what you've put together. I just want to let people know one of the ways we're trying to restore some of these relational skills is through Thrive. And so if you have a bonded partner, Thrive would be something that would help you learn how to grow joy, and instead of that pseudo-joy that Darrell talked about today, and how to learn return-to-joy skills and all these things. So we only do one a year in the States, and we have, I think, about a little over a month left of registration. So feel free to learn more about that. We're also doing a Joy Starts Here conference this fall on growing and starting joy in your church, in your family, in your school. We have more Joy Streams on the way. We have David Tackle back next week, Jim Wilder on the 23rd. I'm going to talk in June about problems and your needs. I really want to hear from you on what you see as some of the essential hindrances that you're up against in leadership. And then we have Ken Smith coming to talk about 4+1 stories every pastor should ask their congregations to tell. That's going to be a fascinating one. Darrell mentioned the Joy Starts Here book. Take a look at this. We still have the beta version available, and we're working on assessments right now, so we hope in the next couple of weeks to have the next version out eventually with more assessments, so you can actually look at measuring some of your joy levels and so forth. Really good stuff. Take a look at the website. There's some interactive forums on there. My friend and colleague Carol Brown also has started a Joy Starter blog, and so she's taking a lot of the information that I'm talking about and covering on some of these joy streams and putting it into blog form. So take a look at joystarters.com as well. And Dr. Wilder has lots of good information in the Jesus in Mind, formerly Munchies audio teachings. You can learn a lot more about the life model topics as well. And Ed Corey, Ed has a lot of good stuff. He's developed the Thriving Recover Your Life program, which is trying to start joy in communities and passing on these skills. And so Ed is doing some joy streams as well. I think Ed has a joy stream coming up this Saturday. Is that correct, Denny?
Yes, and yeah, we're still have registration open. It's this Saturday at noon, and it's going to be covering the topics in the first chapter of Joy Starts Here.
Oh, that's going to be good. I'm looking forward to that. So, Darrell, we got to have you back here. I always feel like we're just scratching the surface here. You've got a lot of good stuff to share here, and I just want to thank you. Thank you for being with us today.
Well, you're welcome, and thanks for putting up with my crazy technical issues.
We pulled it off. Praise God. So thank you for being here. Thank you, Denny, for all your work that makes these things happen. We couldn't do it without you.
You're
so
welcome.
Bless you. And I just want to thank all of our viewers and our listeners. Thank you for being here. And again, I hope that you'll dive into some more of these resources that we're offering here. And join us next week. The fun just keeps going. So may God bless you today and continue to grow your joy.